Today, before jumping on to the issue that we want to discuss, I want to talk about a resignation letter. A very bold resignation letter, a resignation letter that bared very intricate workings of an organization, very complex political structures that were embedded in an organization. I will be reading out a few lines from that resignation letter in certain context. Meanwhile, you can make a guess which publication this lady was working with who has written this resignation letter. Now, she writes in the aftermath of the 2016 American elections. She writes about the victory of President Donald Trump. She makes a mention of it, and she says in that context in her resignation letter, and I quote, "Instead, a new consensus has emerged in the press, but perhaps especially at this paper where she was working, that truth isn't a process of collective discovery, but an orthodoxy already known to a few, an enlightened few, whose job is to inform everyone else." The second quote I'll be reading out is in context of the impact Twitter had on its editorial direction, the kind of inspiration it took from Twitter, the entire editorial structure of the paper she was working in. She says, "Twitter is not on the masthead of the newspaper, but Twitter has become its ultimate editor. As the ethics and mores of the platform have become those of the paper has itself become increasingly a kind of a performance space." This is what she says about the impact of Twitter on the paper she was working in. Now, coming to the third quote. This is generally about the search for truth. This is a very random, perhaps something in the greater context she wrote about truth and risk-taking in journalism. She says, and I quote, "But the truth is that intellectual curiosity, let alone risk-taking, is now a liability at the paper she works in. Why edit something challenging to our readers or write something bold only to go through the numbing process of making it ideologically kosher when we can assure ourselves of job security and clicks by publishing a 4,000 op-ed arguing that Donald Trump is a unique danger to the country and the world?" And she says that is how self-censorship has become the norm at the paper she was working in. Now, this resignation letter has been making headlines. It's being discussed. No, it's not from India. The lady is not from India. The publication is not from India. If you haven't guessed, even now, I'll give you a little background about the woman who wrote this resignation letter. Her name is Bari Weiss. She worked with Wall Street Journal before joining this paper. Before that, she was an editor with a publication known as The Tablet. She's been working extensively in the field of journalism, has published a book on anti-Semitism. So she has this elaborate experience in the field of journalism. And here is the last quote she writes in the resignation letter, which perhaps comes across as very disturbing. And I quote, she says, "They have called me a Nazi and a racist." She speaks about her co-workers there. "I have learned to brush off comments about how I'm writing about the Jews again. Several colleagues perceived to be friendly with me were badgered by co-workers. There were some co-workers who insisted that I need to be rooted off the company if it's supposed to be a truly inclusive one." This is the kind of allegations she makes in her resignation letter, perhaps revelations. She says, "I know that some employees smear me as a liar and a bigot on Twitter with no fear that harassing me will be met with appropriate action. That is, because of a certain stand on issues, particularly about what she writes about the Jews, she faces backlash from within the company, within the publication, which is supposed to be home to a variety of ideas, to versatile ideas." The publication she was working for was the New York Times. That is the big thing we are going to discuss today. The anti-Hindu, the anti-Jew sentiment, the kind of liberalism we see in the mainstream media now, and why are we seeing it? Now, it's just not about New York Times. Before we move to New York Times in particular, there are a lot of the question of other major liberal publications. Now, one of them is The Economist. The Economist, in its coverage of India, especially since 2014, it has always found a way to blame the Prime Minister, Narendra Modi, for something that has been wrong with India. They have tried projecting that this is not a democratically elected leader, but he is more of a dictator who's been elected on the basis of envy and hate and separatism and things like that. That's economists. Their take on India's certain policy issues has been very negative without going into the depth of the issue, without trying to understand how were certain things done. For instance, demonetization. Economist is not alone. Just yesterday on Foreign Affairs, there was an article about India written by an Indian author, perhaps, that argued that, again, India was slipping into an age of Hindu nationalism where minority rights were in danger. And Foreign Affairs, time and again, it's one of the oldest newspapers, the oldest magazines, perhaps, in the world. It's been publishing since the First World War. And even then, they also have this narrative about India which focuses on Hindu nationalism. Then there is the Washington Post, there's the BBC, all these publications, they have been very anti-BJP, anti-Hindu. Perhaps they're being anti-Modi or anti-BJP stems from the fact that they're anti-Hindu, just as the New York Times was anti-Jew, or it came across as anti-Jew to Bari Weiss, who wrote that resignation letter. Now, let's take up a few issues to understand this better. When it comes to the election of Modi, of course, a lot of outlets had been making the noise that, oh, this was an emergence of Hindu nationalism. That was one factor. Now, let's come back to India, the kind of double standards we've seen in the mainstream media. We saw the debate of intolerance. We saw that happening in 2016-17, just in the second or third year of the Modi government. We saw the kind of hysteria that was woven around demonetization, around Aadhaar, around many other policies that were otherwise good for the people and in hindsight have proven very good for the people, even if they were to be tweaked a little. Remember how many tweaks were to be made after demonetization, and the mainstream media was quick to call it a failure. Now come back to a little recent time, the CAA, the Article 370, the Ram Mandir verdict, all these events, how they were covered in the mainstream media with only one intention. In some sections of the mainstream media, I would say, with only one intention: to paint Narendra Modi, the Prime Minister of India, as a fascist figure, as a dictator, as someone who's anti-minority. The Prime Minister, since his election campaign that began in 2013, he had to prove that no, he wasn't against the minorities. He wasn't against the idea of minorities thriving in India, but that did not stop the mainstream media from creating a fiasco around the policies of the BJP. And the Western publications have also done the same. The Western publications have done that in their own home country too. Go back to 2016 or the end of 2016 when Donald Trump was elected as the President of America. 2017, 2018, 2019, we were convinced that somehow Russia had something to do with the election or with the victory of President Donald Trump. The front pages of those newspapers, they made news every day that Russia is involved. Russia has meddled into the US election. Somehow that Cold War strategy was being propagated again and again. The same thing we saw in Brexit. Somehow the people in the United Kingdom, they were forced to consider that no, Brexit is not good for you. It was almost as if they were being forced by certain sections of this liberal media to believe that no, Brexit is not good for you. If you vote against or if you vote for Brexit, you will be doing a great disservice to humanity. Such is the kind of narrative that is built upon. Where and why has the hegemony of the liberal media been challenged? How did that happen? The social media. The coming of Twitter, the coming of Instagram, Facebook, WhatsApp, it gave people a voice. Earlier, truth was confined to the opinion writers, the editors of certain liberal media outlets. If we talk about the West, the Economist, the Foreign Affairs, the Washington Post, the New York Times, the BBCs. They were the ones who used to have a say on how the truth shall look. In India, we saw it with some leading newspapers like the Hindu, for instance. The social media broke that chain. The social media broke that idea. People found a voice and people said that no, we want our voices to be heard more than we hear your voices. It was a simple idea that people wanted to make themselves heard. Now, this reminds me of a line from one of my favorite movies. It's Captain America, the Winter Soldier. And one of the characters, Nick Fury, says that he says about his organization, we see the world as it is, not as we would like to be, as we would like it to be. That's what he says to Captain America. This is the problem with mainstream media today, the section of the liberal media which is starting to incline on the far left. They don't want to see the world as it is, but as they would like it to be. Now, coming to the question of the New York Times, if we come to the question of the New York Times, there's also the kind of publications they have been making for a while. For instance, the kind of stories they have been running. Often the Prime Minister, once in a blue moon, he writes an editorial on the New York Times, but that's very, very rare. If you talk about the usual articles that go on the New York Times, they do not carry an India narrative. But I've just compiled some articles that are from the recent New York Times publications, from the recent times and what they were written. For instance, on August 8, 2019, just after the revoke of Article 317 Kashmir, the New York Times carried out an article which said, "Kashmir in a cage. India annexes Kashmir and brings us back to the partition." This was written in the New York Times. Then, when it was about the CAA, it was about the NPR, the NRC, that debate had started to spring up. There was a September 11 headline, 2019, which said, "Why is India making its own people stateless?" Then there is a editorial which, if we go back in certain time in 2007 and 2019, before the elections, it talks about Modi campaign. The Modi's campaign is of fear and prejudice. This is what they wrote about Narendra Modi. Then writing something about the BJP, another headline which was carried on in the New York Times was, "They peddle myths and call it history." This was about the BJP. What they wrote about the Congress? The remarkable comeback of Rahul Gandhi. This was written on April 22, 2019. Surely Rahul Gandhi would go on and lose another election, another national election, subsequently resign from the party. But this brings us to an important question. We've seen the kind of biased coverage that happens in the mainstream media. The resignation letter of Bari Weiss is another example. Now, Bari Weiss is just not one of your many staff writers or opinion editors of the New York Times. She was once called the 7th most influential Jew in the world by the Journalism Post. She was also called the Times star opinion writer by Vanity Fair. When she got the 7th most influential Jew tag from the Israeli newspaper, her parents were not impressed, perhaps because they were expecting a better rank for her. That was the kind of stature she had, and even then she struggled in the New York Times, in one of the biggest publications of the world, in one of the most read publications of the world. This brings me to an important question, the question I want to leave you with. If someone like Bari Weiss had to struggle so much just because she was taking a stand for Jews, imagine how much an average worker who might not be noticed or as published as Bari Weiss was in the liberal media, what are they supposed to do to secure their jobs? As she writes in the resignation letter, to secure your job and the traffic, just adhere to a certain ideology. This is what the liberal media wants its people to do. How right is that? How ideal is that, given media is the 4th pillar of democracy? Is it correct for something like that to happen? The resignation letter of Bari Weiss to the New York Times leaves us with this important question. It leaves us also with the question, with the idea, if the liberal mainstream media is anyway more honest as it once was. This is a question you should be thinking about today. Thank you so much.